The woman convicted of murdering Mexican-American music star Selena has been denied parole.
I didn't know how to operate a gun. I've never had one. And so
some stories refuse to stay buried. No matter how many years pass, no matter how many tributes are sung or candles are lit in her name, the truth about what really happened to Selena Quintanilla keeps clawing its way back to the surface. And every time it does, it brings with it something heavier than grief. It brings questions. Questions that the people closest to her have spent 3 decades carefully avoiding. Questions that fans have whispered to each other at memorials, at concerts held in her honor, and in comment sections that stretch for miles. The mystery surrounding the death of the Queen of Tejano music was never really a mystery in the legal sense. There was a conviction. There was a sentence. The world watched it all unfold on live television in the fall of 1995. But a courtroom verdict and the full, unvarnished truth are not always the same thing. What has slowly emerged in the years since, through interviews, leaked accounts, documentary footage, and the painful testimony of those who loved her most, paints a picture far more complicated, far more heartbreaking, and far more troubling than the simple story of a crazed fan who pulled a trigger. The truth, as it turns out, isn't comforting at all to understand what happened to Selena Quintanilla. You first have to understand who she really was. Not the icon, not the legend, not the sparkling figure in rhinestone bodysuits who commanded stadiums of screaming fans, but the woman underneath all of that. The real Selena. And the real Selena was someone who had been carrying an enormous weight for most of her life. Born on April 16, 1971, in Lake Jackson, Texas, Selena grew up in a Mexican-American family with deep ties to music. Her father, Abraham Quintanilla Jr., recognized her extraordinary vocal talent almost before she could properly read. By the time she was 9 years old, she was already performing in public. By her early teens, she was a frontwoman of a family band, traveling across Texas in a van that barely ran, performing at quinceañeras, small clubs, and roadside venues for whatever money they could scrape together. There was no glamorous beginning to her story. There was sacrifice, exhaustion, and the relentless pressure of a father who saw greatness in his daughter and was determined, at any cost, to make the world see it too. What is rarely discussed with full honesty is what that pressure did to Selena on the inside. Public accounts have always leaned heavily on her joy, her infectious laugh, her generosity with fans, her radiant warmth that seemed to reach through a television screen and grab you by the heart. And all of that was real. Nobody who knew Selena disputes her genuine kindness. But kindness, warmth, and joy can coexist with exhaustion, doubt, and a quiet, private suffering that never makes it onto the stage. Those who were closest to her in her final years have spoken, carefully and sometimes reluctantly, about a different side of Selena's interior life. A Selena who was tired. A Selena who was beginning to ask uncomfortable questions about her own autonomy, about whether the decisions being made in her name were truly hers, or whether she had simply been molded so carefully over so many years that she could no longer tell the difference. The empire her father had built around her was extraordinary, but empires have walls. And Selena, at 23 years old, was beginning to feel them closing and no honest examination of Selena's life can sidestep the central, complicated, and deeply contested figure of Abraham Quintanilla. To call him simply a stage father is to dramatically undersell both his influence and the moral complexity of what he built. Abraham was a man of genuine ambition, genuine love for his daughter, and a controlling nature that often made it impossible to separate the two. He managed every significant aspect of Selena's career from the very beginning. He chose the songs. He approved the outfits. He negotiated the contracts. He determined when she was ready to take the next step, and, crucially, when she was not. When industry insiders began expressing serious interest in positioning Selena for an English-language crossover, a move that could have catapulted her into mainstream American pop culture years before her death, Abraham repeatedly delayed and deflected those conversations. His reasoning was rooted in a genuine belief that the timing needed to be right, that the Tejano fanbase needed to remain the foundation. Whether that instinct was correct or whether it was, on some level, also about maintaining control is a question that historians and music industry figures still debate. His grip extended with full force into her personal life. When Selena fell in love with Chris Perez, the gifted guitarist who had joined the family band in 1989, Abraham's reaction was swift and furious. He fired Chris. He demanded Selena choose. He framed the relationship as a threat to everything they had built, a distraction that could unravel years of sacrifice. What he perhaps could not admit, even to himself, was that what truly threatened him was the idea of Selena choosing someone, that he had not selected for her. Selena and Chris eloped in secret in April 1992. It was an act of profound courage from a young woman who had spent her entire life being directed, managed, and molded. It was also an act of desperation. The elopement was not a romantic whim. It was the only way she could claim one corner of her life as entirely her own. Abraham eventually accepted the marriage, welcomed Chris into the fold with the pragmatic grace of a man who understood when a battle was lost. But the dynamic never truly changed. The architecture of control remained standing, even as Selena continued to grow into a global phenomenon. By 1994 and into early 1995, Selena's world was expanding at a pace that was both thrilling and destabilizing. Her album, Amor Prohibido, had become a massive commercial success. She was on the cusp of releasing her English-language debut, the project she had dreamed about for years. She was opening boutiques, building a fashion line, expanding her business portfolio in ways that reflected genuine entrepreneurial vision. She was becoming, in every measurable sense, her own woman. And somewhere in that transition, the cracks in the world Abraham had constructed began to show. The story of Yolanda Saldivar is not simply the story of a killer. It is the story of what happens when desperation for connection is mistaken for devotion, and when devotion is mistaken for trustworthiness. Understanding how Yolanda moved from a fan writing letters to a woman standing in a motel room with a gun requires understanding the particular vulnerability that Selena carried, a vulnerability that had been created, in no small part, by the environment she lived in. Selena existed inside a tight, controlled circle. Her family was her management, her band, her social world, and her safety net, all at once. That kind of closeness can be beautiful. It can also be suffocating. And it can make a person desperately, almost recklessly, hungry for a relationship that exists outside of it. When Yolanda Saldivar appeared in 1991, enthusiastic, devoted, tireless, she arrived at exactly the right moment. She wasn't family, which meant she wasn't part of the machinery. She seemed, to Selena, like someone who loved her freely, without agenda. Yolanda proposed the idea of an official fan club to Abraham Quintanilla in 1991, and Abraham approved it. That single decision opened a door that nobody fully understood at the time. Within months, Yolanda had moved from fan club president to trusted insider. Within a few years, she was managing Selena's boutiques, Selena etc., in Corpus Christi and San Antonio, overseeing finances, supervising staff, and operating with a degree of unsupervised authority that was, in retrospect, staggering. The warning signs came early and were ignored consistently. Employees at the boutiques reported financial irregularities. Payroll was missed. Expenses appeared that nobody could fully explain. Staff described Yolanda as emotionally volatile, manipulative, and capable of psychological cruelty toward those who questioned her authority. Designer Martin Gomez, who worked closely with Selena's fashion line, reportedly described Yolanda's behavior in terms that should have alarmed anyone listening. She was not merely difficult. She was dangerous in the quiet, corrosive way that certain kinds of people are dangerous, through the slow erosion of everyone else's sense of reality. But Yolanda's armor was Selena's trust. And Selena's trust was, paradoxically, one of her most beautiful and most fatal qualities. She believed in people. She extended generosity where others would have built walls. She looked at Yolanda and chose to see the devotion rather than the obsession, the loyalty rather than the dependency. When concerns were raised about Yolanda's behavior, Selena's response was often to explain it away, to suggest that Yolanda was overwhelmed, that the situation was more complicated than it appeared, that it could be resolved without public confrontation. In March of 1995, the confrontation could no longer be avoided. Evidence of significant financial misconduct, missing funds, falsified documents, accounts that simply did not balance, was assembled and presented. Abraham, Selena, and her sister Suzette sat across from Yolanda, with the truth laid out in front of them. Yolanda denied everything. Abraham demanded her immediate removal from all business operations. Selena, visibly torn, agreed. But there were documents, financial records crucial to untangling the damage Yolanda had done, that Yolanda still possessed. And Selena, still believing, still hoping, that the woman who had claimed to love her so completely could be reasoned with one final time, agreed to meet her privately to retrieve them. That meeting was scheduled for March 31st, 1995, at the Days Inn Motel in Corpus Christi. It would be the last decision Selena Quintanilla ever made. The physical facts of what happened in room 158 of the Days Inn are documented in police reports, forensic analyses, court testimony, and the words Selena herself spoke in the final moments of her life. They are not in genuine dispute, regardless of what Yolanda Saldivar has said in the years since. Selena arrived at the motel that morning to retrieve the documents. The conversation between the two women escalated. By 11:48 in the morning, a single shot was fired inside that room. The bullet, a hollow point round, struck Selena in the lower right shoulder, traveling on a downward trajectory that severed a major artery and caused catastrophic internal bleeding. This detail matters. The angle and nature of the wound were examined extensively by medical and forensic experts during the trial, and their conclusion was consistent and unambiguous. The wound was not consistent with an accidental discharge. It was consistent with an intentional act. Selena managed to flee the room. She staggered through the corridor, bleeding heavily, and collapsed near the lobby. Her words in those final moments were clear and deliberate. She identified her attacker. She named the room. She told the people around her exactly what had happened, exactly who had done it, in the precise, conscious, heartbreaking way that someone speaks when they understand they are running out of time and need the truth to survive them. She was transported to Corpus Christi Memorial Hospital. She was declared brain dead shortly after arrival. She was 23 years old. Yolanda Saldivar barricaded herself in her truck in the motel parking lot and held police at bay for nearly 10 hours before surrendering. She was tried for first-degree murder, convicted in October 1995, and sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 30 years, that if the legal verdict was clear, the narrative Yolanda Saldivar has constructed around herself in the decades since has been anything but. In recent years, particularly as her 2025 parole eligibility approached, she gave interviews that fundamentally shifted her account of what happened in that motel room. Where her original defense centered on the claim that the shooting was accidental, a tragic misfire during a struggle, her more recent statements have introduced a new and deeply troubling element. The suggestion that Selena herself was confrontational, that the situation escalated because of Selena's behavior, that Yolanda was acting out of fear and confusion rather than murderous intent. This revision was rejected immediately and forcefully by everyone with direct knowledge of the facts. It was contradicted by the forensic evidence. It was contradicted by eyewitness accounts. And it was, most powerfully of all, contradicted by the dying words of the victim herself, who had the presence of mind and the moral courage to tell the truth even as her life was leaving her body. Legal analysts who examined Saldivar's statements in the context of the parole process noted that her refusal to accept genuine responsibility was almost certainly a contributing factor in the Texas Board of Pardons and Parole's decision to deny her request for early release in March 2025. Parole boards do not operate in a vacuum. They assess rehabilitation, remorse, and the ongoing risk an individual poses to public safety. Reframing a deliberate killing as something the victim partially caused is not an expression of remorse. It is its opposite. It is a continuation of the same manipulative behavior that defined Yolanda's relationship with Selena from the very beginning. The denial of parole brought an enormous outpouring of response from the public and from Selena's family. Fans who had organized petitions, held vigils, and flooded social media with demands that Saldivar remain incarcerated felt something that was not quite joy, because there is no joy available in any of this, but something closer to relief. The sense that the justice system had, at least on this occasion, gotten it right. Chris Perez spoke publicly after the decision, saying that while nothing could undo the loss, he was grateful that the law had affirmed the value of Selena's life. The Quintanilla family echoed those sentiments, emphasizing that the denial was not about vengeance, but about the integrity of accountability itself. The final, lingering mystery in the story of Selena Quintanilla is not about what happened in a motel room in Corpus Christi. It is about something quieter and more philosophically uncomfortable. It is about who controls the truth of a person's life once that person is gone. Abraham Quintanilla and the Quintanilla family, operating through their production and licensing company Q Productions, have maintained extraordinarily tight control over every dimension of Selena's public image since her death. They have approved projects. They have rejected others. They have participated in some documentaries and very publicly condemned others. The Netflix series Selena, the series which received the family's full blessing, presented a version of Selena's life that was warm, celebratory, and carefully shaped by those who loved her, but also undeniably by those who have significant financial and personal stakes in how she is remembered. Critics, including scholars, journalists, and members of Selena's own fan community, have raised pointed questions about whether the family's control over her narrative serves the truth or simply serves a preferred version of it. The complicated dimensions of Abraham's relationship with his daughter, the internal pressures she experienced, the doubts she privately harbored about the people around her. These elements tend to disappear in family-approved productions, smoothed over in favor of a story that is easier to sell and more comfortable to live with. Meanwhile, other documentaries, particularly those that have attempted to examine the case from multiple angles, including Yolanda Saldivar's perspective, have drawn fierce condemnation from both the family and large segments of the fan base. The ethical questions they raise are real and unresolved. Is it exploitative to humanize a killer? Is it irresponsible to give a convicted murderer a platform to revise her story? Or does a complete understanding of how this tragedy unfolded require looking at every piece of it, even the uncomfortable ones? There are no clean answers. What is certain is that Selena Quintanilla was a human being of extraordinary talent, genuine compassion, and remarkable resilience who deserved more time. She deserved the English-language album she had worked so hard for. She deserved the creative autonomy she had begun to reach for. She deserved the chance to grow into the fullness of who she was becoming. None of those things were given to her. They were taken in a motel room by someone she had trusted with far more than she should have.